Hey guys, tonight we slip into a story that smells faintly of grape sweat and a little too much questionable decision-making under the Mediterranean sun. You're lying there, eyelids growing heavier, while we talk about a god who wasn't supposed to make it past infancy. Imagine that your father is Zeus, king of the gods, and your mother is a mortal princess named Semele, and you tiny, half-divine, you are doomed before you can even cry for milk. You probably won't survive this, spoiler alert, but somehow, against all odds, you do. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're Semele, or at least you're sitting close enough to feel the heat of her nervous breath. She's pregnant, and she knows the father is no ordinary lover. Zeus is in the picture, which sounds glamorous until you realize his wife is Hera, queen of heaven, patron saint of jealousy with a specialty in punishing romantic rivals. The gossip around Thebes is brutal. Semele is either blessed or doomed, and people can't decide which. You lean in closer, noticing how she trembles when Hera, in disguise, whispers poisonous doubts into her ear. Hera's plan is classic sabotage, convince Semele to demand Zeus reveal his true form. No mortal can handle that sight. And sure enough, when Zeus finally thunders in with all his lightning and divine radiance, Semele burns away instantly, leaving behind only a fragile, unborn child. Here's the wild part: Zeus doesn't let the baby perish. In what might be history's strangest form of emergency parenting, he sews the fetus into his own thigh. Yes, his thigh. Not the most sanitary incubator, but it works. And so Dionysus is born literally cut from Zeus's flesh. Historians still argue whether this myth reflects older fertility cults stitched together, pun intended by later storytellers, or whether it was simply Greek poets inventing shocking metaphors for rebirth. Either way, you're looking at a god who began life as a rumor, stitched and scandalous. You imagine the scene, the Olympians raising eyebrows, Hera plotting her next move, mortals whispering about the baby who technically has two mothers and a father with a scar on his leg. It's both tragic and absurd, and you can't help but smirk. Zeus, the Almighty, playing nurse with a needle and thread. The mainstream fact is clear: Dionysus is the only Olympian to have a mortal mother. The quirky tidbit: some cults later called him the twice-born, which makes him sound less like a god and more like an indie band. As the newborn cries, you realize this is not the end, but the beginning of something restless, chaotic, and oddly sleepy. Because soon enough, wine will trickle into the world, and so will the drowsy, swaying calm that comes with it. For now, though, you just see a baby whose very existence feels like a mistake no one dares to correct. And in that mistake, history begins to wobble forward. You've barely wrapped your head around a baby being sewn into Zeus's thigh when the story lurches forward, because no divine birth is ever safe. Hera, still fuming with jealousy, is determined to snuff this kid out. You picture yourself as a nanny in ancient Thebes, clutching the swaddled infant and nervously glancing at the sky, waiting for some thunderbolt of vengeance. You already know Hera's record with children that aren't hers. Heracles had snakes sent to his cradle, remember? And now here's Dionysus, helpless, squealing, and already at the center of cosmic drama. Zeus can't exactly keep the baby on Mount Olympus. Hera would never stop hunting him, so he sneaks the child off like some guilty father hiding evidence. One version has Hermes whisking Dionysus away and delivering him to Ino, Semele's sister, and her husband Athamas. You imagine their household already struggling, already chaotic, and now suddenly stuck with the half-divine baby of the king of the gods. Great. Try explaining that to the neighbors. And Ino does what many resourceful women in myths do. She disguises the boy. She dresses him up as a girl, long robes and all, to trick Hera into looking elsewhere. Picture little Dionysus toddling around, tiny curls bouncing, wearing gowns stitched to conceal his godhood. It's equal parts clever and awkward, like the original version of witness protection, only with more embroidery. Of course, Hera catches on. She never fails to sniff out deception, and when she realizes what's going on, she drives Ino and Athamas into madness. You watch as their home crumbles into screaming and chaos children tossed into boiling pots, a husband hallucinating his wife as a lion. It's horrific, yes, but the gods never really went easy on mortals caught in their squabbles. So Dionysus is on the run again, handed off like a divine hot potato. Zeus finally turns to an unusual solution, the nymphs of Mount Nysa. These woodland caretakers raise him among ivy and streams far from Hera's gaze. Here's the mainstream fact: the mountain's exact location was never fixed. Greeks argued whether it was in Thrace, Asia Minor, or even far-off Ethiopia. The quirky tidbit: some late poets thought Nysa was made up entirely, basically an ancient, undisclosed location. And the scholarly debate historians still argue whether this myth hints at Dionysus's foreign origins tied to winemaking practices imported from outside Greece. In your mind, you picture a boy chasing goats across hills, sticky with grape juice, while nymphs hum lullabies in languages older than Greek. His childhood is nomadic, always at the edge of someone's suspicion. He's twice born, but also twice hidden, an identity wrapped in costumes and exile. You notice the theme starting to take shape. Dionysus doesn't grow up in the safety of Olympus like Apollo or Athena. He's raised by mortals, nymphs, wanderers, the people on society's margins. And maybe that's why he'll always belong to outsiders, the drunk, the dancers, the dreamers, and yes, the ones who fall asleep mid-party. As the boy grows, so does the grapevine. Somewhere someone crushes fruit into a vessel, lets it ferment, and discovers that juice can change moods. Dionysus is too young to invent wine yet, but you can feel the shadow of it following him like a prophecy. It's in the sweetness of the air, the heaviness of drowsy eyelids, the tilt of the earth itself. And in that sleepy pull, you sense that the world is about to get both more chaotic and more relaxed at the same time. You're still lounging on that imaginary hillside when Dionysus suddenly starts poking around the edges of human curiosity. Grapes hang heavy on the vine, and someone, whether a nymph, a shepherd, or the young god himself, decides not just to eat them, but to crush them. Imagine sticky purple juice running down your hands, staining your tunic like you've been in some low-budget horror film. You lick your fingers, and it's sweet tart, refreshing. Leave it a while longer, though, and the juice changes. It ferments. It bubbles, it grows sharp and heady, filling the air with a sour, sweet perfume that promises something. That's the moment Dionysus leans in. He isn't like Apollo, who hands you a lyre, or Athena, who gives you olive oil. No, Dionysus offers you something unstable, something that can warm your belly and loosen your tongue, or knock you flat on your back snoring in the dust. Wine isn't just a drink, it's a personality switch in a clay cup. You picture villagers in Thrace or Phrygia testing this new potion. A sip makes them giggle. A few gulps and they stumble around the fire, inventing dance moves so bad they'd get banned on TikTok. A little more, and bam, they collapse in sleep so deep even Zeus's thunder wouldn't wake them. Congratulations, humanity, you've just invented both the party and the nap. Here's the mainstream historical fact: archaeology shows that winemaking actually began thousands of years earlier in regions like Georgia and Mesopotamia. The quirky tidbit: some ancient Greeks believed Dionysus discovered wine by accident when a grape-filled goatskin was forgotten in the sun until it began fermenting. And the scholarly debate, historians still argue whether Dionysus represents a truly Greek deity or if his worship was imported from the Near East, along with the knowledge of fermentation. So there's young Dionysus testing the limits of his new gift. He hands a cup to a shepherd who laughs until he falls asleep against a tree. He pours another for a nymph who bursts into song and refuses to stop until dawn. You too sip from that clay cup in your imagination, the warmth spreading through your body, your eyelids drooping even as your smile widens. The god of wine isn't just teaching you to drink, he's teaching you the art of surrender, of letting go. But of course, nothing divine comes without consequences. Hera, ever suspicious, starts sniffing around again. Dionysus is no longer just a hidden child, he's a teenager with a dangerous invention. People whisper his name, hold secret feasts in his honor, and Hera feels her controls slipping. Imagine her glaring down from Olympus, like an angry landlord who just discovered you're running a nightclub in the basement. Dionysus, though, keeps moving. His wandering nature begins here, vineyards sprouting behind him like footsteps mortals, trailing after him with cups in hand, half in awe and half in stupor. He's building something bigger than a family recipe. He's building a culture of release, of ecstasy, of drowsy collapse that will stretch from Greece to India. And even as you drift deeper into this story, you realize something wine was never just about taste. It was about permission, the permission to dance, to laugh, to rage, and eventually to sleep. Dionysus doesn't just bring intoxication, he brings the nap afterward, the blissful blackout where dreams shuffle in like uninvited guests. You tilt your head back, feel the warmth settle, and hear the faint buzzing of cicadas over the hills. Dionysus smiles, and for the first time you understand this, God isn't just about chaos. He's about the sweet collapse at the end of chaos, the world's first divine lullaby, fermented in a jar. By now you've realized that Dionysus doesn't exactly do quiet hobbies. Once wine slips into the world, it doesn't just stay tucked away in some village festival. No, it spreads like spilled grape juice across a marble floor, unstoppable, staining everything it touches. You trail after him as he begins wandering from place to place, a young god with a permanent entourage. Imagine a parade that never ends, satyrs with goat legs tapping out uneven rhythms, maenads with ivy crowns shrieking joyfully, and ordinary mortals swept up like interns who thought they were signing up for one office party and ended up on a 6-month bender. Everywhere Dionysus travels, vineyards spring up. Farmers scratch their heads as wild vines curl around fence posts overnight. Towns discover that after he leaves, they suddenly know how to crush grapes in presses, ferment them in clay jars, and seal the vessels with resin to keep the good stuff from turning into vinegar. It feels miraculous, though part of you suspects Dionysus would just wink and say, trade secret. The mainstream historical fact here: ancient Greek symposiums, the drinking parties where men reclined on couches, debated philosophy and got progressively sillier, became central to cultural life. And the quirky tidbit: some of those symposiums had wine masters chosen to decide how watered down the wine would be. Imagine the social pressure of being the guy who either makes everyone pleasantly tipsy or ruins the night by mixing it at orange juice strength. The open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether Dionysian rituals began as agricultural festivals that simply got rowdier over time, or if they were always meant to be ecstatic, spiritual blowouts. You walk in this endless caravan of revelers, and it's both thrilling and exhausting. There are drums pounding, flutes trilling, and dancers twirling until they collapse in sweaty heaps asleep before the stars even rise. One part of you wants to complain that there's no Wi-Fi, but another part admits this is oddly relaxing. Wine has a way of blurring sharp edges of both reality and memory. Of course, wherever Dionysus goes, not everyone is thrilled. Kings frown as their citizens abandon work to dance in ivy crowns. Parents complain that their daughters are sneaking out at night to join processions. You can practically hear grumpy city officials muttering, "We didn't budget for spontaneous goat leg drum circles this quarter." Hera, unsurprisingly, still isn't happy. Every time Dionysus wins more followers, she fumes like someone who keeps losing followers on Instagram. Rumors say she sends messengers monsters and madness to trip him up. Yet somehow, every setback only makes him more popular. People love a rebel god, especially one who brings snacks and naps. You sip again from your imaginary clay cup, and the world around you sways in rhythm. It's not just drunkenness, it's something stranger, a sense of connection. The goat-legged satyr slaps your shoulder like an old friend. The maenad offers you a wreath of ivy, giggling as she pushes it onto your head. You realize Dionysus isn't just teaching mortals to drink, he's teaching them to blur the line between divine and human, between waking and sleeping, between order and chaos. And so the god keeps wandering. From Thrace to Thebes, from Phrygia to the islands of the Aegean, he builds his legacy. Each vineyard is a breadcrumb on his path, each party a ripple that grows wider. You follow already a little woozy, wondering how far this strange adventure can go. You're barely steady on your feet when the scene shifts again, this time toward the city of Thebes. The music quiets to an uneasy silence, as if everyone senses that something important is about to happen. Dionysus doesn't just wander with his followers, he loves a good showdown, and Thebes is where one of his most famous confrontations takes place. Thebes, of course, has a reputation. It's the city of Oedipus, of riddles, of stubborn rulers who never seem to read the fine print on prophecies. At this moment, the king is Pentheus, a young, proud ruler who isn't exactly thrilled about citizens ditching their daily duties to go dance barefoot in the woods. Imagine trying to run a kingdom while half the population is chanting and twirling with wine-stained smiles. It doesn't make for efficient tax collection. The mainstream historical fact tucked here: Greek tragedy, especially plays like Euripides' Bacchae, used this very conflict, Pentheus versus Dionysus, to explore themes of control order and what happens when you try to suppress human instincts. The quirky tidbit: some ancient theatergoers reportedly fainted during performances of the Bacchae, not because of gore, but because the ecstatic chanting and rhythms mimicked real Dionysian rituals. And the scholarly debate: historians still argue whether the myth of Pentheus reflects actual political resistance to cults of Dionysus, or was mainly a literary invention to entertain audiences. As you stand beside Dionysus, you notice he isn't rattled by Pentheus's threats. If anything, he smirks like someone who's just been told they can't bring snacks into a movie theater, knowing full well the snacks are already smuggled inside. Pentheus orders Dionysus arrested, chained, and locked in a cell. For a moment you wonder if the young god has finally met his match. But then you hear it, the clatter of chains falling loose on their own, the rumble of the palace shaking like it has indigestion. Dionysus slips away as easily as a dream fading at dawn. Here's where things get both eerie and a little funny. Dionysus disguises himself and convinces Pentheus to dress up like a woman so he can spy on the mysterious Bacchic rituals in the hills. You watch in disbelief as the king of Thebes fusses with robes, makeup, and even a wig. Pentheus thinks he's sneaking around incognito. In reality, he looks like an extra in a bad school play. It's one of those moments where you'd laugh if you weren't also nervous about what comes next, because the next part is dark. The Bacchantes in their frenzy mistake Pentheus for some wild animal, and things end badly for the king. You can feel the lesson heavy in the air. Resist the god of wine and abandon, and you risk losing more than just your sobriety. As the dust settles, you notice Dionysus isn't exactly triumphant. He's calm, almost sorrowful. It's as if he's saying, "You could have danced with me. Instead, you fought me." And that never ends well. You realize that Dionysus's real power isn't just over grapes and goblets. It's over that part of the human spirit that longs to let go, to blur boundaries, to find meaning in chaos. You follow the crowd as they drift back into the woods, their songs softer now, their heads heavy with both wine and lessons. And though you know the myth is grim, you can't help thinking, maybe a nap really is the safest option after all this drama. The scene drifts from Thebes to a quieter stretch of countryside where the air smells faintly of fermenting grapes and freshly trampled soil. You trail after Dionysus and his ever-growing band of followers, their laughter and footsteps echoing against the hillsides. They aren't always chasing drama or kings to challenge. Sometimes they're just tending vines, pressing grapes, and experimenting with turning ordinary fruit into something extraordinary. You lean in as Dionysus himself crouches beside a tangled cluster of vines. He runs a finger along the leaves like someone brushing a child's hair, and suddenly you notice how alive the plants seem. Wine isn't just a drink to him, it's a living gift, an alchemy of earth, sun, and patience. The mainstream historical fact here: archaeological evidence shows winemaking in Greece as early as 2000 BCE, with amphorae discovered containing residue of fermented grape juice. The quirky tidbit: some of those amphorae also contained traces of pine resin because ancient Greeks thought mixing it in would keep the wine fresh. Spoiler, it gave it a taste. some modern drinkers would politely call acquired. As you watch, Dionysus encourages farmers to share their drink not just with each other, but with the gods in ritual. That's how wine slips into religious life, poured out in libations, sipped in sacred gatherings used to blur the line between mortal and divine. The scholarly debate comes in here. Historians still argue whether the spread of Dionysian rites across the Mediterranean was mostly religious enthusiasm or clever trade promotion by wine-producing regions. Was it faith, or was it marketing with grape juice? No one's quite sure. The peasants sing while they crush grapes barefoot in big stone troughs. It looks messy, sticky, maybe even unhygienic by modern standards, but there's a strange charm to it, like watching people stomp their way to happiness. You can't help but imagine your own feet sinking into that squishy purple mash. Probably not the kind of spa treatment you'd book today, but hey, free pedicure. The wine flows, and with it, the stories. Around the fire, Dionysus teaches his companions how wine loosens tongues, sparks ideas, and even softens grudges. The night air grows thick with laughter and secrets being spilled literally as cups tip over. You notice how the people aren't just drinking, they're building something new, a sense of community, of shared joy that goes deeper than chores and taxes. But of course there's always a risk. Some drink to feel closer to each other, others to the gods, and a few just to see how many amphorae they can get through before falling off their stools. Dionysus doesn't judge, he's equal parts enabler and teacher, but you start to see why cities both embraced and feared him. Wine can be healing or destructive depending on the hand that pours it. A joke ripples through your mind as you watch someone nod off mid-cup. So this is how Dionysus became the accidental inventor of the world's first group nap. One moment ecstatic songs, the next snores in harmony. Somewhere a donkey brays loud enough to join the choir. You stretch your eyelids, growing heavy, and realize you're starting to sink into the same rhythm as the revelers, half awake, half dreaming. The firelight flickers, the stars blur, and you're not sure if you're hearing music or just the hum of your own slowing thoughts. Dionysus, meanwhile, watches with a small smile, as if he knows this was always the point: to drink, to dream, to rest. The crackle of the fire fades into something sharper, the stomping of feet and the steady thud of drums. You blink, and the scene has shifted. The little countryside wine parties have grown into something far bigger, an organized, intoxicating parade of worship, celebration, and theatrical spectacle. You find yourself in the middle of the Dionysian festivals, the kind of public revelry that makes you wonder if anyone in ancient Greece actually slept during spring. The festival begins with solemnity, processions carrying ivy wreaths, phallic symbols, yes those, and goats destined for sacrifice. The goat bit isn't random. Tragos means goat, and tragedy literally comes from goat song. You're standing at the roots of drama itself. That's your mainstream fact theatre in Athens grew out of Dionysian festivals, evolving into the tragedies and comedies that shaped Western art forever. The quirky tidbit slips in when you notice that some worshippers wear masks that are comically oversized, with mouths open wide like giant O's. It's not just for dramatic effect. The big mouths help project the actor's voice across a noisy crowd. Ancient surround sound brought to you by pottery masks and lung power. But as the performances unfold, you also see the layers of the ritual. There's music, chanting stories about gods and mortals crossing paths, but also this strange undertone of chaos waiting to erupt. Wine is handed out, laughter grows rowdy, and suddenly the line between play acting and real ecstasy blurs. Someone leaps onto the stage who definitely wasn't cast for the role. The crowd doesn't care, they roar in approval. Historians still argue whether these festivals were carefully orchestrated civic events or genuinely unhinged eruptions of communal madness. Were the Athenians cleverly channeling chaos into art, or did they just have the world's longest weekend bender disguised as religion? The debate lingers, and watching the crowd sway, you're not sure either. Dionysus hovers in the background, not with a king's pomp, but with the sly grin of a host who knows the party only exists because of him. He's less like Zeus tossing thunderbolts, and more like that cool friend who brings just enough chaos to keep everyone awake until sunrise. As the festival stretches into days, you feel yourself pulled into the rhythm. The songs tell of joy and sorrow of kings who defied the gods and peasants who danced with them anyway. Some spectators laugh until their ribs ache. Others weep openly, clutching their neighbors' hands. Theatre is doing its job, helping people feel everything at once. Wine, just smoothing the edges. A joke slips through your head as you watch an entire chorus try to dance in unison while clearly tipsy. Maybe the real tragedy was the choreography all along. You'd clap if your hands weren't busy holding your own borrowed cup of wine. By the time the sun rises, the city feels transformed. The actors are hoarse, the priests exhausted, the revelers hungover, but something lingers in the air. This is more than a festival, it's a collective nap disguised as catharsis. Everyone pours out their chaos so they can return to ordinary life calmer, lighter, maybe even ready to face taxes again. You lean against a marble column, eyelids drooping as the chanting turns soft, the drums fade, and the masks are set aside. The festival might be over, but Dionysus has planted something permanent, a culture that values drama, laughter, and shared release. And you're slipping gently toward the same release, sleep, tugging at your thoughts as if the god of wine and naps had reserved a front row seat for you. The festival's noise drifts away, replaced by a long, dusty road stretching toward a palace you've only heard of in stories. You blink at the brightness of marble walls and glittering mosaics. You've stumbled into the courts where kings, queens, and philosophers tangle over what Dionysus means, not just for wine, but for society itself. Inside the palace, courtiers wear wreaths of ivy, carrying golden cups, trying to look pious, while clearly just tipsy. You notice the irony. Dionysus is the only god who sneaks into elite circles by way of the commoner's jug. Everyone drinks, rich or poor, and suddenly the social gap feels a little less impossible. Your mainstream fact glides in here. Dionysus was a democratic god, worshipped by slaves and women as much as by free men, unusual in a culture where most deities stuck close to aristocrats and warriors. The quirky tidbit comes when you overhear a servant whisper that some noble households kept their own mini Dionysian theatres in private gardens. Imagine backyard karaoke, but instead of singing pop songs badly, you chant about tragic heroes and pretend to be gods. Historians still argue whether these upper-class Dionysian clubs were harmless fun or dangerous subversions of order. Did they unify a society fractured by class, or did they threaten to erode the careful hierarchy Athens loved so much? The debate echoes through marble halls like the clink of amphorae. You drift deeper, watching as philosophers weigh in. Plato, of course, grumbles that poetry and theatre stir dangerous emotions, tugging people away from reason. He's basically the ancient version of that one teacher who banned comic books because they rot the brain. Aristotle, on the other hand, leans closer and insists catharsis. The purging of emotion through theatre is healthy, even necessary. You smile sleepily at their timeless argument. Is it better to bottle up your feelings or to ugly cry in public with a goblet in hand? Wine flows, laughter echoes, and you realize Dionysus isn't just god of chaos, he's become the excuse for social experiments. One moment you're in a debate about civic duty, the next, someone's singing a hymn, half in key, half in hiccup. A royal scribe struggles to keep notes, ink blotting as he nods off mid-sentence. You know the feeling. A joke drifts into your mind as you picture the court officials staggering back to serious council meetings the next day. And now, after discussing goat songs and ivy crowns, let's talk about taxation. If Dionysus is listening, he's probably chuckling. The courtiers eventually slip into quieter tones, the wine pitchers running dry. A servant sweeps away broken cups while another carefully lifts a mask dropped by an actor who danced too hard. You feel the whole scene winding down, the debates unresolved, but the people strangely satisfied. The court has tasted not just the sweetness of wine, but the dizzying idea that chaos can be organized into art, into community, even into politics. Your eyes half close as the palace lights dim, and the air grows heavy with incense. Somewhere in the shadows, Dionysus lingers, never quite leaving, always waiting for the next sip, the next song, the next moment, when mortals loosen their grip on control. You leave the marble palace behind and follow the murmurs of the crowd until they spill into open fields where vines stretch across trellises like green rivers. The air here smells thick with grapes, sun-warmed and ready to burst. You crouch, brush your hand against the clusters, and feel the sticky promise of fermentation. Dionysus, it seems, doesn't stop at theatre or palace. He's also lurking in the dirt beneath your sandals. The mainstream fact is that the Greeks mastered viticulture, early turning hillside terraces into endless vineyards. By the 6th century, BCE wine was a staple export shipped in clay amphorae across the Mediterranean. You picture those amphorae bobbing in ships, their pointed bases stuck into sand to stay upright like ancient juice boxes, if juice boxes were 30 pounds and required 2 guys with strong backs. The quirky tidbit sneaks in when you learn that some farmers poured wine offerings directly onto their vines, believing the plants drank like mortals. Imagine watering your garden not with H2O but with a vintage Merlot and then scolding your tomato plants for developing bad habits. Historians still argue whether Dionysian worship came first as a mystical cult that later attached itself to wine, or whether the everyday necessity of viticulture birthed the god's mythology. It's the chicken or wine grape question, and no one's fully solved it. You walk past labourers stomping grapes in shallow stone vats, their feet purple up to the ankles, singing in sloppy harmony. The rhythm hypnotizes you, a lull of sloshing and laughter. For a moment you wonder if grape stomp marathons were the ancient equivalent of karaoke night, embarrassing in daylight but legendary by torchlight. Somewhere nearby, children chase each other with ivy crowns tripping on their tunics, while old men argue about weather and harvest. Even in this sleepy rural scene, Dionysus feels present, as if each grape holds a secret, a tiny burst of godhood waiting to ferment. You recall earlier temples and theatres, and now it makes sense wine wasn't just a drink, it was the medium that carried his spirit. Sip by sip, chorus by chorus, festival by harvest, the god wove himself into daily life not by thunderbolts or plagues, but by the slow, quiet insistence of the vine. A stray joke drifts in your head as you watch a farmer wipe sweat with a wine-stained sleeve. Congratulations, you've invented the world's first tie-dye grape edition. You smirk in the twilight. The sun sinks lower, casting the fields in a warm haze, and you feel your limbs heavy with that same drowsy sweetness. Maybe it isn't just the workers who nap after pressing grapes. Maybe Dionysus himself planned it this way, wine as lullaby, vines as blankets, dreams seeded among the rows. The songs fade into the distance, leaving you with the soft hum of cicadas and the faint tang of crushed grapes still clinging to the air. You close your eyes for a moment, swaying with the rhythm of vines in the evening breeze. You wander on, and soon the road curls downward toward a coastline, alive with sails and shouting. The Aegean sprawls before you, its waves glittering like shards of broken amphorae. Here you see how the cult of Dionysus didn't just stay put in vineyards and theatres. It hitched a ride across the sea, packed tightly into barrels and stories, floating from port to port like a tipsy stowaway. The mainstream fact is that Greek colonists and merchants spread Dionysian rituals far beyond the homeland. As early as the 8th century BCE, they carried the god's festivals to Italy, Asia Minor, and the islands, often blending him with local deities. By the time Rome got its hands on the idea, Bacchus, Dionysus's Latin twin, was already booking appearances at every banquet worth attending. But the quirky tidbit lies in how sailors supposedly poured libations overboard before long voyages, hoping Dionysus would calm the seas or at least distract the crew with mild intoxication. Imagine a whole trireme, every rower rowing slightly offbeat because the captain thought a mid-journey chug would improve morale. Historians still argue whether these rituals were a unifying cultural export or just clever marketing wine as brand ambassador, Dionysus as mascot. Was it faith Or was it just the world's first PR campaign complete with ivy wreaths instead of billboards? You stroll past dockworkers hefting amphorae with sweaty precision, their chants echoing like a heartbeat. Somewhere in the crowd, actors recite lines from tragedies, staging impromptu plays on planks between barrels. You can almost hear the whisper, "The God is with us even here, even in the smell of fish and salt." A sailor waves you over, offering a cup filled with something sharp and sour. You take a sip, wince, and wonder if aged 3 days in a leaky barrel was meant to be a selling point. He laughs, slaps your back, and calls it an acquired taste. You quietly think it's more like a punishment for bad life choices. Yet, as the cup warms your chest, you feel that familiar Dionysian lull creep in again. The waves rock you, the sails creak like lullabies, and suddenly sea travel doesn't seem so terrifying unless you think too hard about all the wine sloshing below deck. Everywhere you look, the cult spreads: farmers in distant colonies building small shrines, actors exporting plays that end with drunken choruses, feasts that dissolve into drowsy heaps of humanity. Dionysus is no longer confined to the hills of Greece. He's global now, or at least as global as a god could get before airplanes. You catch yourself grinning at the thought Dionysus, the original international influencer. Followers gained not through hashtags, but through amphorae and late-night parties that left entire villages oversleeping. The tide hisses against the rocks, steady as breath. The sailors shout less now, their movements slowed by dusk and fatigue. You lean against a pile of coiled rope, lulled by the sway of the dock. And just as your eyes start to close, you remember this god doesn't let his worshippers drift off too easily. There's always another song, another cup, another celebration waiting around the corner. You leave the shore behind and wander inland, following roads where the dust clings to your sandals and the cicadas hum like half-broken alarm clocks. The path winds toward little villages, places where Dionysus isn't a grand figure of temples and marble, but more of a household guest invited for supper, unannounced at breakfast, and often overstaying his welcome. The mainstream fact is that rural Greeks celebrated small-scale festivals known as rural Dionysia long before the grand urban spectacles. Farmers would carry wineskins from vineyard to village, singing songs that were equal parts gratitude and tipsy nonsense. These events probably laid the groundwork for comedy and satire, giving rise to theatrical traditions that became Athens's claim to fame. The quirky tidbit: during these countryside revelries, people would sometimes strap on crude masks and costumes made from whatever they had lying around. Imagine your neighbor showing up in a cloak stitched from goat hide, a fake beard tied with string, and declaring himself Lord of the Grapes. Historians note that these rustic parades likely inspired the later, more polished theatre masks we picture today. So yes, Dionysus might be the reason your high school drama club had that one kid who really overcommitted to method acting. Historians still argue whether the rural Dionysia was truly democratic, giving everyone rich and poor alike a chance to participate, or whether it was more like a neighborhood block party where the elite still called the shots. The surviving records are vague, like half-remembered party invitations with no RSVP. You wander deeper into one of these villages, and suddenly the air is thick with roasting bread, fermenting wine, and the sweet tang of crushed grapes drying on woven mats. The houses are modest, plastered in white, their courtyards alive with chatter. Children run about with wreaths of ivy perched too large for their heads, pretending to be tiny gods in training. An old woman beckons you over her arm, strong from decades of kneading dough. She presses a clay cup into your hand filled with a drink that tastes halfway between grape juice and questionable medicine. You nod politely, because that's what you do when someone's grandmother hands you homemade anything. A group of men nearby are singing, if you can call it that, an endless chorus of verses that blur into laughter and hiccups. Their rhythm is off, their voices crack, but there's a strange beauty in it. You sit back, letting the sound wash over you, realizing this is the true heart of Dionysus, not just palaces or theaters, but these messy, joyful moments where ordinary people forget the weight of their lives for a night. The torches flicker as dusk deepens, painting the walls orange and gold. Someone produces a drum, someone else claps in uneven time, and suddenly the courtyard transforms into a dance floor. The steps are simple: stomp, turn, shout, repeat, but the energy is magnetic. You're pulled into the circle, arms linked with strangers, your feet stumbling along until the rhythm feels natural, like the earth itself is setting the beat. You think about how festivals like these must have stretched for generations, season after season, linking grandparents to grandchildren in one long chain of songs and spilled wine. And though empires rise and fall, though scholars bicker and kings plot here in the villages, Dionysus remains steady, a reminder that humans above all else crave joy, community, and maybe just one more round before bed. A child tugs your sleeve and hands you a cluster of grapes, sticky with juice. You bite into them, sweetness exploding across your tongue, and suddenly the world feels softer, simpler. The stars emerge overhead, scattered like salt across velvet. And as laughter hums through the night air, your eyelids begin to sag the weight of the day, dissolving into something almost divine. Morning seeps back into the village slowly, with roosters crowing far too enthusiastically and farmers already trudging to fields that look exactly the same as yesterday's. You wander behind them, following the creak of ox-drawn carts and the soft rustle of grain stalks. Out here, Dionysus feels less like a partying god and more like a quiet, necessary companion, a reminder that farming is equal parts toil and celebration. The mainstream fact is that Dionysus wasn't only tied to wine, he was also associated with fertility and the life cycle of crops, woven into the rhythm of planting, harvest, and feast. Farmers depended on his blessing not just to keep their vineyards fruitful, but to ensure that barley, wheat, and olives thrived too. When things went wrong, a drought, a blight, a frost, they sometimes blamed the god for neglecting them. Which, let's be honest, sounds suspiciously like blaming your Wi-Fi router for bad weather. A quirky tidbit: in certain rustic traditions, farmers would bury little figurines of phalluses in their fields to honor Dionysus, hoping to spark fertility in the soil. Imagine trudging along with your plow and stumbling over a row of terracotta good luck charms. The symbolism was clear, if not exactly subtle. Some rituals even involved miniature processions where villagers paraded these figures around like honored guests, which probably raised eyebrows even in ancient times. Historians still argue whether Dionysus's agricultural side was imported from older fertility cults like those of Demeter and Persephone, or whether he grew into the role naturally as wine culture spread across the Mediterranean. Was he a vineyard hitchhiker who expanded into the grain business, or was he always a field-to-table deity? The debate continues, usually with far fewer laughs than the rituals themselves inspired. You pass a vineyard and watch as farmers crush grapes underfoot, their legs stained purple up to the knees. They laugh about whose feet are luckiest for pressing, though you try not to think too hard about the hygiene. The juice flows into wooden vats, bubbling as fermentation quietly begins an alchemy that feels halfway between science and sorcery. Nearby, a group of women weave garlands of ivy and grape leaves, preparing for another evening's celebration. Children scamper through rows of vines, playing hide and seek, their laughter carrying across the fields like birdsong. You realize that Dionysus's gift isn't only the finished wine in the cup, but the entire cycle of joy, from planting and tending to sharing and storytelling. A farmer offers you a handful of dried figs and a clay flask of new wine, and you sit under an olive tree to taste both. The figs are chewy, honey-sweet, the wine is sharp, still a little wild from its recent fermentation. Together they balance each other in a way that makes you nod appreciatively, like a food critic who's forgotten their notebook. As the day warms, the fields shimmer with heat. You drift along dusty roads where bees hum lazily and the air smells of sun-baked earth. In these rural rhythms, you glimpse why Dionysus mattered, not because he was grand or terrifying, but because he made ordinary toil feel connected to something larger, something worth celebrating. Later, as the sun sinks low, villagers gather in a threshing floor cleared for dancing. Torches light the circle, and once again the night hums with song. This time, though, the mood is quieter, more grateful than wild. Farmers toast to good harvests, mothers to healthy children, old men to memories of past festivals. And through it all, Dionysus hovers like a silent guest, never seen, always felt as constant as the turning seasons. You tilt your head back, watching the stars prick open in the darkening sky. The air is thick with the mingled scents of earth bread and wine. And in that moment you understand, for the farmers of Greece, Dionysus was never just a party god. He was the fragile thread between hunger and plenty, fear and joy, silence and song. The music softens your eyelids grow heavy, and the steady beat of the drum lulls you closer to sleep than you'd like to admit. The harvest dances on even as you drift into dreams. You wake, or half-wake really, to the sound of marching feet, a rhythm utterly different from the soft dances of the village. The scene around you sharpens, banners flap in the wind, bronze helmets glint in the sun, and the clatter of armor grinds against the earth like an approaching storm. The cult of Dionysus has wandered into the world of politics and war, and it's not as out of place as it first sounds. The mainstream fact here is that Dionysian festivals sometimes blurred with military campaigns. Soldiers carried him on their standards, prayed for his favor before battle, and occasionally held celebratory feasts that looked suspiciously like tactical drinking sessions. Ancient generals knew that loosening fear through wine could stiffen courage, even if it also made soldiers a little too eager to argue about whose shield was shinier. One quirky tidbit: some units of soldiers would literally stage mock drunken parades right before a fight, complete with ivy crowns and stumbling choreography. Enemies must have been confused. Were these Greeks mocking them, or just unable to walk straight? There's even an anecdote that Macedonian troops under Alexander the Great celebrated Dionysian-style victories with wine-fueled orgies that lasted for days, which must have been a logistical nightmare for supply officers. Imagine trying to ration bread while your army insists on an after-party that doesn't end. Historians still argue whether Dionysus truly had a direct military role, or whether his presence among soldiers was more symbolic, a way to claim divine blessing without the god ever needing to lift a spear. Was he genuinely invoked as a war god, or was his banner simply shorthand for morale and merriment? The debate has never settled, though the soldiers' songs suggest they weren't too concerned with theological clarity. You watch as a company of hoplites paints their shields, some with grapes, others with satyrs or panthers. The designs look more like nightclub posters than military insignias, but they terrify opponents all the same. One soldier jokes about how enemies distracted by a panther decal might trip over their own sandals. Another mutters that Dionysus himself once marched with an army of satyrs and maenads, half-mad, unstoppable, shrieking through the hills like storm winds. The drums quicken and the line advances. You stumble along with them, caught between the clang of bronze and the scent of wineskins passed from hand to hand. At first the drinking seems reckless, then you realize it's ritual designed to knit the men together. Fear turns into laughter, and laughter steadies their hands on their spears. From a ridge you glimpse an enemy force waiting, their own standards fluttering. For a moment the air hangs heavy like a pause before thunder. Then, instead of a charge, the Greeks let out a sudden shout, not of war, but of song. They sing a dithyramb, one of those ancient choruses dedicated to Dionysus' voices, weaving together in eerie harmony. The enemies hesitate, unnerved by warriors who sing instead of snarling, and in that hesitation the Greeks advance with renewed boldness. When the battle finally breaks, it's a blur of noise and dust, shields smashing spears, breaking men pushing in unison. You keep your distance, watching as the lines sway and crash. And strangely, even here, Dionysus feels present, not in blood or rage, but in the ecstatic loss of self, that same abandon you saw in village dances and ivy-crowned parades. By nightfall, the field is quiet. Survivors gather around fires, passing wine, retelling the day, with exaggerations already creeping into their stories. They thank Dionysus for courage, for luck, for survival, for the strange clarity that comes when you forget yourself in the crowd. You sit with them, sipping from a battered flask, and think how odd it is that a god of vineyards became a companion of war. The stars wheel overhead, patient and indifferent, while the soldiers sing one last hymn before sleep claims them. And once again, Dionysus hovers at the edge, half shadow, half laughter, always shifting, always just out of reach. The battlefield fades, and instead of the clash of bronze, you now hear the scratch of styluses on wax tablets, the murmur of philosophers and the rustle of parchment scrolls. You've wandered from the dust of war into the quieter but no less chaotic realm of Greek intellectual circles, places where Dionysus becomes less a god of vineyards and more a puzzle for poets and thinkers to untangle. The mainstream fact Dionysus was central to Greek theatre. His festivals, especially the city Dionysia in Athens, gave rise to tragedy and comedy, the two masks that still define drama today. Plays by Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and Aristophanes were first performed under his divine sponsorship, staged in honor of a god who loved masks, illusion, and emotional excess. You can thank him for every stage curtain ever pulled back since. A quirky tidbit emerges as you eavesdrop. Some philosophers whispered that Dionysus was actually the same god as another one like Hades in disguise, or perhaps just Zeus playing a long-running prank. Others thought he represented not a person at all, but the raw life force of nature, an endless loop of birth, growth, and decay. Imagine being a student trying to write an essay only to discover your teacher insists your subject may or may not exist. Welcome to ancient philosophy. Historians still argue whether Dionysus entered the Greek pantheon late as a foreign import, maybe from Thrace or Phrygia, or whether he was there from the beginning, suppressed by early writers, only to re-emerge in full force later. The uncertainty leaves you standing in the middle of the agora like a confused tourist who's not sure if Dionysus needs a passport stamp or not. You drift through the streets of Athens where a poet rehearses lines under his breath, his voice quivering between ecstasy and fear. A chorus of masked actors practices their dance steps, their masks frozen in exaggerated smiles or grief. The air feels alive with contradictions, laughter, and weeping celebration, and mourning, all bundled together under Dionysus's watchful eye. At a symposium, you recline on a couch among men who've had too much wine and too little self-control. They argue whether tragedy teaches moral lessons or just provides catharsis, a word that feels clinical until you realize it describes exactly the sensation of crying at a sad movie. Someone recites Euripides' Bacchae, where Pentheus is torn apart for resisting Dionysus, and the room shudders into silence. The play feels less like entertainment and more like a warning, mock the god at your peril. And yet intellectuals can't resist poking at him. One suggests Dionysus symbolizes irrationality in the human soul, a force that must be balanced by Apollo's logic. Another insists that surrender to Dionysus is not weakness, but wisdom, that by losing yourself you gain a deeper truth. The debate goes on for hours, nobody winning, everybody drunk, and you suspect that was the point all along. As you slip outside into the cool night, the noise of the symposium fading behind you, the Parthenon looms above, stark and serene. Apollo's temple feels carved from clarity and reason, all straight lines and luminous marble. But down in the shadows among ivy and torchlight, Dionysus waits with his laughter and his masks. Two gods, two visions of the human soul, forever circling each other like dance partners who can't agree on the rhythm. You lie back and watch the stars again, feeling as if every thinker, every poet, every actor has added a layer to Dionysus's shifting form. Is he a liberator or a destroyer, a foreigner or a native, a trickster or a savior? The answer slips through your fingers like wine spilling from a tilted cup. And maybe that's the point. Dionysus is not meant to be pinned down, but to be felt, experienced, and eventually surrendered to. The night deepens and the debates settle into murmurs. A chorus of cicadas hums, steady and hypnotic, like a lullaby offered by nature itself. You close your eyes, realizing that even in philosophy and theatre, Dionysus still teaches the same lesson. Sometimes you learn more when you stop trying to control the outcome, when you let yourself be carried along by the rhythm of the world. The voices of philosophers fade, and now you drift into a softer space where the centuries seem to slow. Dionysus no longer feels like the wild-eyed youth of the mountains or the raucous patron of theatre festivals. Instead, he lingers in memory, in fragments of pottery, in lines of poetry, in whispers that people carried across ages. You walk quietly through a museum-like hall, except it isn't built of stone, it's woven of dreams. Marble busts hover in the dimness, masks hang suspended, wine cups shimmer with faint purple light. You move among them a visitor in the archive of myth itself. The mainstream fact anchor you here. Dionysus survived beyond Greece. The Romans worshipped him as Bacchus with festivals just as wild, and his stories blended into Christian allegories, later wine, rebirth, death, followed by resurrection. His legacy spilled beyond temples into art theatre and even modern psychology, where Dionysian still describes the chaotic, emotional, ecstatic side of human nature. He refused to fade away. A quirky tidbit, some medieval monks, while denouncing pagan gods, still doodled grapevines in the margins of manuscripts, as if their pens couldn't help but remember him. Even today, his name sneaks into places you wouldn't expect: suburban wineries, theatre companies, even brand logos. Imagine the god of divine chaos turned into a label on a wine bottle with a price tag. That's Immortality Capitalist Edition. Historians still argue whether Dionysus was a god of liberation or simply a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when people lose themselves too completely. Was his worship a doorway to higher truth, or just a socially acceptable excuse to get hammered with your neighbors? The debate hums on unresolved like a cicada drone, stretching across centuries. You wander further and it feels like the god himself is walking beside you, sometimes a youth crowned with ivy, sometimes a bearded wanderer, sometimes just laughter on the breeze. Every time you glance, he shifts, never the same shape, twice, always reminding you that he is both everything and nothing. You pass by a cracked wine cup still faintly stained and wonder about the hands that once held it. You imagine villagers who danced until dawn, soldiers who carried him into battle, poets who wrestled with his meaning, and ordinary people who just wanted to taste joy for a little while. All of them felt the same pull, the temptation to let go, to lose themselves, to nap in the warm blur of wine and music, and you realize that was his gift all along. Not just frenzy, not just chaos, but the freedom of release. The freedom to stop clutching so tightly at control. The permission to drift, to close your eyes, to trust that the world will keep turning while you rest. Now the hall around you dims further, its relics softening into shadow. The laughter fades into a gentle hum, and the scent of grapes drifts into the air, faint and comforting. Your body feels heavier, calmer, as if even Dionysus has set down his thyrsus and stretched out beside you for a long nap. And so as you settle deeper into the quiet, the story slows. The edges of myth dissolve like paint running in water, leaving only softness behind. You no longer need to follow the wanderings of gods or mortals. You no longer need to remember every mask, every festival, every whispered debate. You can let them go the way leaves fall gently from a vine in autumn, drifting slowly to the ground. Your breath lengthens steady and calm, each inhale carrying in cool night air, each exhale carrying away the last remnants of thought. The world outside becomes distant like a stage play closing its curtains. You are no longer audience or actor. You are simply resting safe in the hush that follows. The soundscape softens, not drums or shouting choruses, but the rhythm of your own heartbeat, even and sure. A faint hum of cicadas in the background, or maybe the white noise of your fan, gently wraps around you. The air feels warm, then cool, then warm again, like a blanket shifting across your shoulders. Images remain only as whispers: a crown of ivy, a cup of wine, a god who smiles as he fades into dream. You don't need to chase them. You don't need to hold on. They are here, and they will wait for you again another night. Now close your eyes fully, let them grow heavy, let your body sink into stillness. The story is finished and you are free to drift slowly, deeply, peacefully into sleep.